The dress was the color of ripened wheat. Clara had spent 3 weeks finishing it. 3 weeks of needle and thread by the flickering light of a candle, slender fingers working the fabric late into the night in the small room she shared with Marta, her younger sister. It was not a noble woman's dress. It had no gold embroidery, no imported lace from the southern provinces, no pearls sewn into the bodice. It was simple, honest, made from the finest fabric she could buy with an entire month's wages as the village seamstress. But she had made every stitch with care. And that night, as she walked down the stone corridor leading to the great hall of Verith Castle, Clara felt that it was enough. The castle belonged to Clan Verith, one of the middle-ranked packs of the kingdom. Not the most powerful, but respected enough to receive invitations from every other clan during the Banquet of Alliance, the annual gathering where packs came together to reaffirm loyalties, seal agreements, and inevitably announce bonds between wolves. It was the one night when daughters of blacksmiths could pass through the same gates as daughters of lords, provided someone on the inside had invited them. Dorian Verath had invited her. Dorian, the minor lord's son, with his chestnut hair and easy smile, had spent 2 months courting Clara with visits to the village, flowers picked from the riverbank, and soft words whispered at her ear in the marketplace. 3 nights ago, he had promised that at this banquet he would present her to his pack. He had said, she still heard the words with terrible clarity, "I will choose you in front of everyone, Clara. You will see." She had believed him. The great hall was immense. Torches along the walls cast amber light over banners from at least 12 different clans, their crests stitched into heavy hanging cloth. The banquet tables were long as river barges, laden with roasted meats, dark bread, clay pitchers of red wine, and rough ceramic cups. The smell was thick and warm. Meat, burning resin, leather, and something deeper beneath all of it. The collective scent of dozens of wolves in human form gathered in one closed space. For someone born with an Omega's sharpened senses, as Clara had been, it was nearly overwhelming. She held herself steady. Marta had helped her braid her blonde hair before she left. A simple plait tied with a strip of leather cord, no ornaments. Clara had carried a gray wool cloak over her shoulders, modest and plain, which she removed as soon as she entered the hall and handed to a waiting servant. The wheat-colored dress appeared without adornment, honest as she herself was. She found Dorian near the central table. He was laughing with 2 other young men from the pack, a cup in his hand. And when he saw her approach, something passed through his eyes, too fast to be named. Perhaps surprise, perhaps discomfort. He did not step forward to receive her. Dorian. She approached with composure, her hands joined in front of her dress. "Good evening. Clara." The smile he offered was smaller than the one she remembered. "I'm glad you came." There was a woman beside him. Clara had not noticed her immediately. Tall, dark-haired, wearing deep green with detailed embroidery at the cuffs, the daughter of some allied lord by the way she carried herself. The 2 of them stood close in a manner that was not accidental. "May I introduce you to someone?" Dorian said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like a preemptive apology. Clara did not answer. She was looking at the space between them, at the way the woman in green kept her arm near his, at the way he had not taken a single step toward Clara since she had arrived. She understood before he even spoke. The ceremony of bond declarations came an hour later, when Lord Verath rose at the head of the main table and struck his goblet against the wood 3 times. It was the signal. The packs fell silent. The entire hall turned toward the central table. Clara was sitting on a bench near the wall, beside an old serving woman who had taken pity on her and offered a seat. She kept her back straight, and her hands flat on her knees. "Tonight," Lord Verath announced, in the low carrying voice all alphas used when they wished the whole room to listen, "my son Dorian declares his bond before the assembled clans." A murmur of approval moved through the hall. Dorian rose. He walked to the woman in green. He placed her hand over his. The entire hall saw. Clara saw. The old serving woman beside her made a small sound, something between a breath and a word, and reached out to touch Clara's arm. Clara did not move. She did not look away from the table. She watched the whole thing with the stillness of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that falling apart in public was a luxury she could not afford. The applause that followed was warm and unhurried. People raised their cups. Someone near the back let out a celebratory howl, low and pleased, and others joined briefly before the sound faded back into conversation. Clara stood. She did it carefully. She smoothed the front of the wheat-colored dress with both hands. The dress she had spent 3 weeks making. The dress that now felt like evidence of something she wished she could take back. She picked up her wool cloak from the bench beside her. She did not look at Dorian. She did not search for his eyes across the room. She simply turned toward the nearest side corridor, the one that led back toward the entrance hall, and began to walk. She walked slowly. She would not run. She had that much, at least. The corridor was dimly lit by a single torch set in an iron bracket near the ceiling. The noise from the great hall softened behind her with each step. The laughter, the music from a pair of string instruments someone had begun playing, the low-layered conversation of 100 wolves who had already moved on to the next thing and forgotten she existed. Clara pressed one hand briefly against the cold stone wall and breathed. She was 23 years old. She had no pack, no title, no land. She had a room shared with her sister, a set of sewing needles, and a dress the color of wheat that no one had looked at twice tonight. She had believed a man's promise and walked into a room full of wolves who ranked higher than her in every way that this world counted, and she had done it, wearing her best work. She breathed again, steadied, lifted her chin. She would reach the entrance hall, retrieve her cloak properly, and walk out the main gate. She would not weep until she was past the castle wall, and perhaps not even then. She was 3 steps from the turning in the corridor when she heard them. Voices, male, more than one. Coming not from the great hall behind her, but from ahead, from the direction of the entrance hall itself. Heavy footsteps that did not bother with quietness, the kind that belonged to men who had never needed to make themselves small in a room. Clara slowed. She had no reason to stop. The corridor was wide enough for several people to pass. She would simply move to one side and let them through and continue on her way. There was no reason to stop. And yet something in the quality of that silence, the silence that preceded them, the way the air itself in the corridor seemed to change, made her feet hesitate. They came around the corner into the torchlight. 3 of them. The first was broad and fair-haired, with a jaw like carved limestone, and a grin that arrived before the rest of him did, easy and slightly dangerous. He wore a dark doublet with silver clasps and a short traveling cloak thrown back from one shoulder, as though he had just arrived and had not yet bothered to announce himself to anyone. The second was leaner, darker, with sharp eyes that moved over everything in the corridor, with the quick amusement of someone who found the world continuously entertaining. He had 2 throwing knives at his belt, visible and unashamed, and he was already saying something under his breath to the third man that made the corner of his mouth pull upward. The third man said nothing. He was the tallest of the 3. Black hair pulled back in long braids, a few loose strands falling forward. Eyes the pale, startling blue of winter sky through ice. He wore dark leather armor cross-strapped at the chest with wide brown belts, bracers on both forearms, a fur-lined cloak across his shoulders that was not decorative. It was a traveling cloak, worn and real. There was a scar along his jaw, faint but visible in the torchlight. He moved with the unhurried authority of someone who had never once in his life wondered whether the space he occupied was his to take. He was looking at her, not past her, not through her, directly at her. Clara held still. The fair-haired one glanced between her and the third man, and something shifted in his expression. The grin became something more considered. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. "That is an interesting beginning to an evening." The man with the knives said nothing, but his sharp eyes moved between Clara and the tall man with an attention that felt like arithmetic. The tall man had not yet spoken. He simply looked at her in the torchlight, standing at the entrance to the corridor while the sounds of the banquet drifted distantly behind her, and Clara felt, with a certainty she could not explain and did not trust, that he was not seeing the dress or the simple braid or the reddened eyes she had been carefully controlling for the past 10 minutes. He was seeing something else entirely. She did not know what it was. She did not know who he was. She knew only that the three of them were blocking the corridor, and that something had changed in the few seconds since they had rounded the corner, and that the night was no longer moving in the direction she had planned. "Forgive me," she said, her voice steady. "I was leaving." The tall man's head tilted, just slightly. He still did not speak, but he did not move aside either. The tall man's name came to her 3 seconds later. It came the way dangerous things often do. Not announced, but remembered. A fragment surfaced from somewhere in the back of her mind, from the stories Marta used to beg passing merchants to tell, from the whispered conversations she had overheard at the marketplace between women who spoke his name, the way people speak of storms and wolves and things that cannot be reasoned with. Orion Ashvale, the Lycan king, not a pack lord, not an allied alpha attending a minor clan's banquet. The Lycan king himself, ruler of the Iron Crown, sovereign of every pack in the kingdom, the wolf above all wolves, was standing in a dim corridor of Verith Castle, looking at her with pale blue eyes as though she were the most interesting thing he had encountered in a considerable length of time. Clara's hands, clasped in front of her dress, tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew what he looked like. Every person in the kingdom knew what he looked like. Descriptions passed from village to village the way all important things traveled, by word of mouth, adjusted slightly with each telling but always containing the same essential elements. The braids, the height, the scar, the eyes. She had simply not expected to meet him in a corridor while fleeing a banquet. "You said you were leaving?" the fair-haired man said, pleasantly. He had crossed his arms, in no hurry whatsoever. "But you haven't moved." "Neither have you," Clara replied. The man with the knives made a quiet sound that might have been amusement. Orion finally spoke. His voice was low and even, with the particular quality of a sound that did not need to be raised in order to reach every corner of the space it entered. "What is your name?" It was a simple question. It should have been easy to answer. Clara had been answering that question her entire life, at the marketplace, at the Lord's house where she delivered finished garments, at every door in the village she had ever knocked on with a bundle of mended cloth under her arm. She answered it now. "Clara." A pause. "Of the village of Ashenford. No clan name, no title, no pack to stand behind. Just a name and a place offered plainly, without apology." Orion looked at her for a moment, in which Clara became acutely aware of several things at once. The torch behind her was casting light across the wheat-colored dress. She had not entirely succeeded at keeping her eyes dry in the last 10 minutes, and the Lycan king was close enough that she could detect the edge of his scent. Pine resin, cold iron, something darker underneath. Something that her omega senses registered with an involuntary attention she immediately resented. "Clara of Ashenford," he repeated. Not mocking, simply careful, as though he were placing the words somewhere he intended to keep them. "Your Majesty," she said, because whatever else was happening, she was not going to forget her manners in a corridor. "I apologize for blocking your path. If you will permit me—" "You were not blocking our path." He said it without particular inflection. "We came around the corner. You were already here. Then I apologize for being here. That also requires no apology. The fair-haired man, she would learn his name later. For now he was simply the grinning one," glanced at Orion with an expression of quiet fascination, as though watching something unfold that he had not expected to see tonight and was finding considerably entertaining. Clara straightened slightly. She was not a tall woman. Her head would have come to Orion's shoulder, perhaps slightly above. But she had spent her whole life standing straight in rooms where she had no particular right to be, and the posture came to her naturally now. "I was at the banquet," she said, because the silence had stretched to the point where filling it seemed better than letting it continue. "I was leaving early. That is all." If you are heading to the Great Hall, it is at the end of this corridor and to the left. I know where the Great Hall is, Orion said. Of course. A breath. Then I will not delay you further. She moved to step past them. There was space to the right of the fair-haired man. Not generous space, but enough. She moved toward it with her chin up, and her hands steady, and the very particular dignity of someone who has decided that this night will not break her, regardless of what it has already taken. She was almost past him when the fair-haired man spoke. She smells like the banquet, he said, conversationally, to no one in particular. But she doesn't smell like she had a good time at it. Clara stopped. She turned her head very slightly toward him. He met her gaze with perfect cheerfulness, completely untroubled by the look she was giving him. That, she said quietly, is none of your concern. Probably true, he agreed. Calder, by the way, since we are sharing names. We were not sharing names. You asked for mine and I gave it. That is different. Semantics, Calder said, delighted. The man with the knives, who had been quiet until now with the patience of someone accustomed to watching conversations develop before choosing whether to join them, spoke for the first time. Something happened to you in there. His voice was quieter than Calder's, more precise. Before you will dismiss it as none of our concern, and you are correct that it isn't, you should know that the scent you're carrying is the kind that tends to draw attention in a hall full of wolves. Whatever you are feeling is considerably more visible than you think. Clara looked at him. He had the decency to say it without cruelty, as simple information, which was perhaps the only reason she did not immediately walk away. I am aware, she said, which is why I am leaving. A reasonable response, he said, and stepped back to give her clear passage. She had moved 2 steps forward when she heard Orion's voice again behind her. He chose the Lord's daughter, Vareth's ally, the one in green. Clara stopped walking. She did not turn around immediately. She stood in the corridor with her hand near the stone wall, and the torchlight moving over the wheat-colored dress and the distant sounds of the banquet carrying faintly from behind them all. Then she turned. Orion was watching her. He had not moved. He stood exactly as he had before, unhurried, contained, with that particular stillness that was not passivity, but something more like the opposite of it. The stillness of something that did not move, because it had no need to. Yes, she said. He invited you, Orion said. It was not a question. Yes, and promised you something. The accuracy of it was not pleasant. She held his gaze anyway. He did. Orion was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How long ago did he make that promise? 3 nights ago. And tonight he stood beside her for the opening hour before the declaration. Clara blinked. You were in the hall. We arrived early, before the main entrance. A slight pause. I saw you when you came in. Something about that sentence was difficult to account for. She filed it away and dealt with what was in front of her. Then you know everything that happened, she said. And you know I was leaving quietly. So I would appreciate... You made that dress yourself. She stopped. The words arrived without warning, said in the same even tone as everything else he said, and they landed with the particular weight of a thing noticed when it was not meant to be noticed. Yes, she said after a moment. The stitching at the hem is yours, the kind that comes from someone who knows what they're doing and has no one else to do it for them. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. That is a very specific observation, she said finally, for a man who was watching from across a hall. I have good eyes. Calder made a sound behind him. Orion did not acknowledge it. Clara of Ashen Ford, he said, and the way he said her name was beginning to do something she was firmly refusing to name. You should not leave yet. I believe I should. There are wolves in that hall who have not yet had the opportunity to see you properly. He paused, barely. That would be a considerable waste. The corridor was quiet between them for a long moment. The torch burned. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door closed. Clara looked at the Lycan king standing in the dim corridor with his traveling cloak and his ancient braids and his ice-pale eyes, and she thought about Dorian Verath's hand, closing over the woman in greens, and about 3 weeks of careful stitching, and about Marta, back in the village, who had said, "You look beautiful, Clara. You always look beautiful," and about what it meant that the Lycan king had apparently watched her walk into a room full of wolves and had then followed her into a corridor. She thought about all of those things in the space of a breath. "I am not going back into that hall," she said clearly. "No," Orion agreed. "Then I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I am suggesting," he said, "that you come with us. The Eastern Gallery has a better view of the courtyard and considerably less noise." He let a moment pass. "And no Dorian Verath." Calder, behind him, raised his eyebrows with visible approval. The man with the knives said nothing, but the way he was looking at her had shifted. Not with pity, not with amusement, but with the particular attention of someone reassessing a situation. Clara looked at Orion for a long moment. "Why?" she said simply. It was the right question. She knew it was the right question. And she intended to stand in that corridor until she had an honest answer to it, regardless of who she was asking. Orion held her gaze. "Because you walked out of that hall without making a sound," he said, "when most people would have made one, and I want to know why." It was not the answer she had expected. It was, however, an honest one. Clara breathed in slowly. She looked at the corridor behind them, toward the entrance hall, and the gate, and the road back to Ashen Ford, and the small room, and the cold hearth, and Marta asking her in the morning how it went. Then she looked back at him. "I don't know the Eastern Gallery," she said. "I do," said Orion. A pause. "Lead the way, then," she said quietly, and she followed the Lycan king away from the corridor, away from the banquet, and into the part of the night that had not yet been decided. The Eastern Gallery was nothing like the Great Hall, where the banquet burned with torchlight and noise and the collective heat of 100 wolves pressing against one another in celebration. The gallery was cool and quiet, lit by iron braziers set at wide intervals along the walls, their flames small and steady. The ceiling was lower here, arched in old stone that had darkened with age to the color of charcoal. Narrow windows ran along the outer wall at regular intervals, tall, unglazed, open to the night air, and through them came the smell of the courtyard below, wood smoke and wet earth, and the distant tree line of the forest that surrounded Verath Castle on 3 sides. Clara walked to the nearest window and looked out. The courtyard was mostly empty at this hour. 2 guards crossed the far end in unhurried rotation. A horse shifted in the stable beyond the inner wall, its breath visible in the cold air. Above the forest, the sky was the deep blue-black of a night well past its middle hours, and the stars were thick and indifferent and very beautiful. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the stone sill and breathed. "Better," said Calder, from somewhere behind her, with genuine curiosity, and very little of the irony she had expected from him. "Yes," she admitted. She heard him settle onto a stone bench against the wall, entirely comfortable, as though he spent a significant portion of his life making himself at home in other people's castles. The man with the knives, whose name, she had learned on the walk up the gallery stairs, was Aldrich, the king's second and head of his personal guard, had positioned himself near the gallery door with the practiced invisibility of someone whose job was to be present without being noticed. Orion stood at the window 2 spaces to her left. He was looking out at the same courtyard, but she had the sense that he was not seeing it the same way she was, that where she was looking at the guards and the horse and the stars, he was tracking something else entirely, some internal geography that the view only partially reflected. "You knew who he was," he said, without turning. "When you saw us in the corridor." It was not a question, but she answered it. "Yes. A moment after I saw your face. And yet you spoke to me the same way you would have spoken to anyone blocking your path." You were blocking my path. A brief silence. Then, from Calder on the bench, I like her. You like everyone, Aldrich said from the door. That is categorically untrue and you know it. Clara turned from the window slightly. Orion had not moved, but his head had tilted just barely in her direction, the way she had noticed he did when something caught his attention. Not a full turn, not a dramatic gesture, just that fractional adjustment that cost him almost nothing, and meant considerably more than it appeared to. How long have you been coming to Vareth's banquet? He asked. Tonight was the first time, she said. I was not invited before. Vareth invited you. Dorian Vareth, his son. I know who he is. A pause. He courted you for 2 months. Clara looked at the side of his face. You said you saw me come in tonight. You did not say you knew anything about the 2 months before tonight. I didn't, until you told me. He turned from the window then, fully, and looked at her. 2 months, a promise 3 nights before the banquet, an address you made yourself. That is not a small investment. No, she agreed. It was not, and he made the decision to choose the other woman before tonight. The way he stood with her during the first hour was not the posture of someone who had just decided. He had known for some time. Clara held very still. Yes, I believe so. He allowed you to come anyway. He invited me. She chose her words carefully. Whether that was kindness or cowardice, I have not yet determined. Orion was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed in tone. It was still even, still low. But something underneath it had shifted, the way water shifts in depth when the riverbed drops. Cowardice, he said. He wanted someone present who would remind him of what he was giving up. It made the choice feel more significant. Men like that require an audience for their own decisions. The honesty of it was a little startling. Clara looked at him for a moment. That is an unkind assessment. It is an accurate one. Both things can be true. He looked at her with those pale blue eyes and said nothing for a beat, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, not quickly and superficially, the way most people read one another, but slowly, with the patience of someone accustomed to looking at things until they revealed what they actually were. Sit down, he said then. You have been standing since you left the hall. I am fine standing. I know you are. He gestured toward the stone bench across from Calder. Sit anyway. It was not an order, precisely. It was the kind of statement that occupied the same territory as an order without technically being one. A thing said by someone who was accustomed to compliance, but was, in this particular instance, offering it as something closer to a request. Clara sat. Calder produced from somewhere inside his traveling cloak a small flask and offered it in her direction with raised eyebrows. It is wine, he said, from the southern provinces, not the questionable vintage they are serving downstairs. Where did you get that? I brought it. I have learned not to trust other people's cellars. Clara almost smiled. She took the flask, took a careful sip. It was good, warm and dry, and handed it back. You travel with your own wine, she said. I travel with many things, Calder said pleasantly. Aldrich travels with throwing knives. The king travels with silence and an expression that makes people reconsider their life choices. We are each of us prepared in our own way. Orion did not react to this. Clara suspected this was because he had heard some version of it many times before, and had long since stopped finding it worth addressing. She looked at him. He had moved from the window to the opposite side of the gallery, where a large map of the kingdom had been hung on the wall. Old, the ink faded at the edges, the parchment darkened with age. He was studying it with his arms crossed, and she noticed that he did not stand the way Dorian Vareth stood, or the way Lord Vareth stood, or the way any of the other wolves she had seen tonight at the banquet stood. He did not perform his authority. He simply occupied it, the way a stone occupies a hillside, without effort, and without the need for anyone to acknowledge it. Why are you really here? Clara asked. At Varath's banquet. A Lycan king does not attend minor clan gatherings without reason. No, Orion agreed, still looking at the map. And the reason is not something you're going to tell me. Not tonight. Fair enough. She looked down at her hands in her lap. The wheat-colored dress looked different in the gallery light, less like a statement and more like what it actually was, a piece of work she had done carefully because she did not know how else to do things. Can I ask you something else? Yes. In the corridor, when you said you had seen me come in. She kept her voice level. What did you mean? That it would be a considerable waste if the wolves in the hall did not see me properly? The gallery was quiet for a moment. Calder was looking at his flask with the focused attention of a man pretending he was not listening to every word. Aldrich near the door might as well have been part of the wall. Orion turned from the map. He walked toward her slowly, not quickly, not with any urgency, and stopped a few feet away, standing and looking down at her with that particular quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered worth looking at. When you walked into that hall, he said, every alpha in the room registered your scent. Clara frowned. I am an Omega. My scent is not... Your scent is not what an Omega's scent should be. He said it plainly without drama. I noticed it from across the hall. Calder noticed it. Aldrich noticed it. From across the hall, she repeated. Yes. That is not possible. Omega scent doesn't carry that far. He held her gaze. Correct. Which is why what you carry is not a common Omega scent. A pause. It is something older, rarer. Another pause. I have encountered it once before in my life. In a manuscript that described a lineage the kingdom believed extinct for 3 generations. The gallery was very quiet. Outside the unglazed windows, the night moved over the courtyard in its slow, indifferent way. The braziers burned. Somewhere below, the distant sound of the banquet continued, muffled and irrelevant. Clara looked at the Lycan king. What lineage? She said. That, he said quietly, is what I intend to find out. He held her gaze steadily. But not here. Not tonight in Varath's castle, where the walls hear everything, and half the men at that banquet table have already noticed that the Lycan king left the hall and has not returned. Clara absorbed this. They will come looking for you, she said. They already are. Aldrich, he said without turning. How long? 10 minutes, Aldrich said from the door. Possibly less. Lord Varath sent a servant to check the eastern corridor 4 minutes ago. Then we have less time than I would like, Orion said. He was still looking at Clara. I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. I have not been anything but honest with you since the corridor, she said. I know. That is why I am asking. A breath. Did anyone in your family ever speak to you of old blood? A grandmother, a great-aunt, someone who kept records, a name passed down that no one explained. Clara was very still. The question arrived in the gallery like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples immediate and spreading before she could stop them. Because the answer was yes. Her grandmother, on her mother's side, had kept a small wooden box under her bed. Inside the box was a piece of folded parchment that she had never unfolded in front of Clara, only held it sometimes in the evenings by the fire, as though the weight of it in her hands was enough. She had called it the record of who we were. She had died when Clara was 11, and the box had never been found after. Yes, Clara said carefully. Someone. Long ago. Orion looked at her with those pale eyes. Then we need to leave Varath's castle, he said. Tonight. From downstairs, barely audible, came the sound of footsteps in the stone corridor below. More than one pair, moving with the deliberate purpose of men who had been sent to find someone important. Clara stood up from the bench. She smoothed the front of the wheat-colored dress with both hands, the way she had done in the great hall, the way she always did when she was deciding something. "Where would we go?" she asked. "My camp is 2 miles east of the castle wall," Orion said. "Beyond the tree line. 40 of my men, 4 horses to spare, and answers I cannot give you inside these walls." She looked at him for one long moment. "I came tonight with nothing but a dress and a promise someone else broke," she said. "I have very little left to lose." "I know," he said, and then more quietly, "That is not a permanent condition." Clara held his gaze. Something in those words settled in her chest, in a way she did not entirely understand, and did not try to explain. "Then lead the way," she said. Again, and the corner of his mouth, just barely, just for a moment, moved. The forest east of Vareth Castle was old. Clara could feel it the moment she stepped past the tree line. Something in the quality of the darkness changed, became denser and more deliberate, as though the trees themselves had been standing long enough to develop opinions about who moved between them. The path was barely a path at all, more the suggestion of one, a slight parting of the undergrowth that Orion followed without hesitation and without a torch, relying on the wolf's natural sight that Clara, despite her Omega blood, also possessed in some diminished form. She could see well enough. She kept pace. Behind her, Calder walked with his cloak pulled close, occasionally lifting a low branch out of his own way with the expression of a man who preferred open roads, but had learned not to complain about them. Aldrich moved last, silent as he had been all evening, his presence more felt than heard. "You're not afraid of the dark," Calder observed, from behind her. "No. Most people slow down in forest this thick at night." "I grew up near Ashenvale Wood," she said. "The trees there are older than these." A pause. "I used to collect herbs along the edge at dusk when I was young. My grandmother taught me which ones to pick without a light." "The grandmother with the box," Orion said, ahead of her. He had heard. Of course he had heard. His hearing, she was beginning to understand, was not merely exceptional. It was the kind that caught things not meant for it as a matter of course, the way a deep river catches everything the current carries. "Yes," she said. "What was her name?" "Sereth." Clara said it carefully, the way she always said it, preserving the shape of it. "Sereth of the Western River Clans." She never used a clan name after she moved to Ashenford. My mother said she left the clans before I was born and never spoke of why. Orion said nothing immediately. He walked, and Clara walked behind him, and the forest moved around them in its slow, dark way. "Sereth," he said after a moment. "Western River." Another pause, longer. "That name appears in the manuscript I mentioned, in the lineage record of the Vale bloodline." Clara's feet kept moving. She made herself keep walking. "I don't know that name," she said. "Few people do." His voice carried back to her evenly through the trees. The Vale line was a branch of the original Lycan bloodline, before the packs divided into clans and territories. They were not rulers. They were something older than rulers. Keepers of the first bond, the records called them. Wolves who carried the oldest scent, the one that predated pack hierarchy, predated Alpha and Omega designations as we understand them now. He paused. When the packs divided 3 generations ago, the Vile line was thought to have ended. No surviving members were recorded. "But the manuscript suggested otherwise," Clara said. "The manuscript suggested one branch may have continued in secret. A woman who left the Western River clans before the Great Division and moved inland, away from pack territory." He glanced back at her briefly through the trees. To a village, possibly, where her bloodline would be invisible, unregistered, unknown. Clara walked in silence for a moment. "You knew," she said then. "When you saw me come into the hall tonight, you already suspected." "I suspected something when I caught the edge of your scent from across the room," he said. "It was not until you spoke in the corridor, until I heard the cadence of your voice and saw the way you held yourself in a room where every advantage was against you, that I became certain enough to act." "Certain of what, exactly?" He stopped walking. Clara nearly walked into him. She caught herself 2 steps back, and he turned. And in the darkness of the forest, with only the distant suggestion of the camp's firelight coming through the trees ahead, she looked up at his face. "Certain that you were not what Dorian Verith thought you were," he said. "Not what any of them thought you were. Standing in that hall tonight in a dress you made yourself, waiting for a boy who was never going to choose you because he did not have the eyes to see what he was looking at." The words landed in the quiet of the forest and stayed there. Clara held his gaze. She would not look away. She had spent all evening not looking away from things, and she was not about to start now. "And what was he looking at?" she said quietly. "A woman who carries the oldest blood in the kingdom in her veins," Orion said, "and has been living in a village mending other people's clothes because no one ever told her what she was." The firelight ahead was closer now. Clara could hear the camp. Low voices, the shift of horses, the particular muffled sound of men who had learned to be quiet by profession. She breathed. "I am still a seamstress from Ashen Ford," she said. "Whatever my grandmother's blood was, whatever that manuscript says, I am still exactly who I was this morning." "Yes," Orion said. "You are." And then, "That is not a lesser thing. It is the foundation of a greater one." He turned and continued walking. Clara followed. The camp was well ordered in the way that spoke of long practice. Fire at the center, tents arranged in a careful perimeter. Horses settled at the eastern edge with a guard who moved among them quietly. The men who looked up as Orion entered the tree line did not scramble or salute with noise. They acknowledged him with a nod, some with a fist briefly pressed to the chest, and returned to what they were doing. 40 men, as he had said, each one carrying themselves with the contained readiness of wolves who answered to no pack lord below the king himself. A tent near the central fire had been prepared. Clara understood from the way Aldrich moved toward it without being directed that this was standard procedure, the king's space established before the king arrived. She hesitated at the edge of the firelight, uncertain suddenly of what her place was in any of this, when Calder appeared at her elbow with a cup of something hot. "Broth," he said. "From this morning's pot, but still warm. Drink it. You are very comfortable giving orders for someone who is not the king." "I am comfortable doing most things," Calder said pleasantly. "It is one of my better qualities." She took the cup. The broth was good. Thick, herbed. Warmer than she expected. She wrapped both hands around it and stood by the fire and let the heat work its way into fingers she had not realized were cold. Orion spoke briefly with 2 of his men in low tones. Something about the road north, a schedule Clara did not have the context to follow. His posture while he spoke was the same as it had been all evening, the same unhurried containment. But she noticed now that his men looked at him differently than Verith's men had looked at their lord tonight. Lord Verith's men had watched him with the careful attention of people monitoring a source of authority they depended on. Orion's men watched him with something closer to, she searched for the word, trust. The specific kind of trust that is not blind, that has been earned through things she had not witnessed but could sense in the room between them. She was studying the fire when he came to stand beside her. "We ride for the Iron Keep at first light," he said, "if you are willing." The Iron Keep. The seat of the Lycan king, the largest fortress in the kingdom, 3 days' ride north. That is a significant journey for someone you met in a corridor an hour ago. "Less than an hour," he said. "That does not make it less significant." "No." A pause. "But the records I need are there. A full lineage library, older than anything Verith keeps in that castle. If your grandmother was who I believe she was, the proof will be in those records. And if the proof exists, if it exists," Clara said carefully, "what changes?" He looked at her. "Everything," he said. "For you, for the packs, for the question of what the oldest blood in the kingdom means in a world that has forgotten it existed." Clara stared into the fire for a long moment. She thought about Ashen Ford, about the small room and the sewing needles and Marta's face in the mornings, about her grandmother's hands holding a piece of folded parchment by firelight, the particular reverence of the gesture, the way she had never explained it, and now never could. About Dorian Varath's hand, closing over another woman's, and about a corridor, and a question she had not expected to be asked, and the way the Lycan king had looked at her in a dim hallway as though she were something worth looking at. "I need to send word to my sister," she said. "She will worry if I don't return by morning." "Aldrich will arrange a messenger tonight," Orion said without hesitation. "Before dawn." Clara looked at him. "You anticipated that." "I anticipated that you are a person who thinks of others before yourself." A pause. It was not difficult to predict. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I want it understood," she said quietly, "that I am coming because I want answers. Not because I am following you. There is no conflict between those two things. I know. I am saying it anyway." "Good," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, simple, direct, without condescension, that settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since she walked into the great hall 3 hours ago. She looked back at the fire. "One more thing," she said. "Ask. Why did you come to Vareth's banquet? The real reason." The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called once and went quiet. "I received a report 2 months ago," Orion said, "from a traveling scholar who had been cataloging old manuscripts in the western provinces. He found a partial lineage record that mentioned a woman matching your grandmother's description leaving the river clans 70 years ago." A breath. The record also contained a passage about what it meant, if that bloodline continued. What it would mean for the kingdom. He paused. "I came to Varath's banquet because it is the one gathering where wolves from every territory and rank attend in the same room. The one night when someone from a village could walk through the same gate as a lord's son." Clara was very still. "You came," she said slowly, "looking for someone like me." "I came," Orion said, "looking for you specifically." The scholar's record included the name of the village. She turned to look at him fully. "You knew I would be here." "I believed you might be. I did not know until I saw you walk in." A pause, the briefest one. "And then I knew." The camp was quiet around them. The fire burned. The stars above the tree line were the same stars she had seen from the gallery window, indifferent and very beautiful and impossibly far away. "You could have introduced yourself," she said, "in the hall, before all of it." "Yes," he said, "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to see who you were first," he said, "before you knew who I was." Clara held that for a moment, turned it over. "And who am I?" she said. "Based on what you saw." He looked at her across the firelight, and what was in his expression was not the careful, diplomatic blankness she had seen him wear in the corridor, or the focused attention with which he studied maps and men. It was something quieter than both. Something that had not been there an hour ago and was there now. "Someone," he said, "who deserved better than what that hall gave her tonight." Clara looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she looked back at the fire. "Get some rest," she said quietly. "If we ride at first light, you'll need it." She heard, rather than saw, the faint shift of something in him. Not quite a laugh, something adjacent to one. "So will you," he said. And he walked to his tent, and Clara sat by the fire with her broth going cold in her hands, and the night moved on around her, slow and dark and full of things that had not yet been decided. They rode north at first light. Clara had slept 3 hours on a bedroll inside a spare tent that Aldrich had arranged without ceremony or comment. And when she woke, the camp was already half dismantled around her, the men moving with the quiet efficiency of wolves who had broken camp in the dark many times before. Someone had left a cloth bundle near the tent entrance. Dried bread, a piece of hard cheese, a small strip of salted meat. She ate standing up, watching the horses being readied, and did not waste time feeling displaced. She had decided, somewhere in the thin hours before sleep, that she would not spend the ride north in uncertainty. She had questions, and she would ask them when the moment allowed, and she would judge what she found at the Iron Keep with her own eyes, and she would not let the size of any of it, the king, the castle, the bloodline, the manuscript, make her smaller than she had been yesterday. She had been small enough, for long enough. That part was done. The Iron Keep appeared on the afternoon of the third day, rising from a flat-topped hill above a river bend, its dark stone walls catching the last of the autumn light and holding it like something precious. It was larger than she had imagined, and older-looking than she had expected. Not the polished grandeur of the castles and the stories Marta loved, but something heavier and more permanent. A place that had stood through several kinds of weather and several kinds of war, and intended to stand through several more. Clara looked at it from horseback without speaking. Calder brought his horse alongside hers. "First time?" he said. "Obviously." "It looks severe from the outside," he said. "It's warmer inside, marginally." "That is not particularly reassuring." "No," he agreed cheerfully, "but it's honest." The lineage library was on the third level of the keep's northern tower, a long room with shelved walls reaching nearly to the ceiling, and a stone table at the center wide enough to lay out 3 full maps at once. It smelled of old parchment and candle wax and the particular dry cold of a room that held things that were not meant to decay. Orion brought the manuscript himself. He set it on the stone table, and Clara stood across from him, and between them the parchment unfolded in sections, its edges soft with age, the ink in places faded to the color of old tea. A lineage scholar named Bren, small, gray-haired, with the focused intensity of a man who had devoted his life to things most people never thought to look at, stood at the far end of the table with a second document, cross-referencing in silence. Clara read. She read slowly, because the script was old, and some of the characters were forms she did not fully recognize, and because the words, once she understood them, required time to absorb. The Vielle bloodline was documented across 11 generations. Wolves who had carried what the manuscript called the first scent, a designation the scholar explained quietly as the oldest form of pack recognition, pre-hierarchical, the kind of scent that bypassed rank entirely and spoke directly to something underneath it, something the body knew before the mind could argue. The line had thinned over generations, the records noted, as the world organized itself into territories and titles and vials intermarried into ordinary clans, and the blood diluted and the scent faded. But not entirely. The last entry in the main record was a woman named Sarath, noted as having left the Western River clans in the 73rd year of the Third Pack era. The record stated only that she had gone inland, away from clan territory, and that her departure had been her own choice, made in full knowledge of what she carried and what it meant. Below that entry, in a different hand, smaller and more careful, was a single line added later. Clara leaned in to read it. "Let what was hidden remain so, until the world is ready to receive it again." She stood back from the table. The room was quiet. Bren was watching her carefully. Calder, who had followed them up and was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms crossed, was for once not saying anything. Orion was watching her. "She knew," Clara said. "My grandmother knew what she was, and she hid it. On purpose." "Yes," Orion said. "The Western clans during that era were in conflict. There were wolves who believed the Vale blood should be controlled, used to consolidate power by whoever held the keeper of that line." A pause. "Your grandmother left to protect it, and to protect anyone who would come after." Clara looked down at the parchment, at the name written there in old ink, Sarath, the wooden box under the bed, the folded parchment held in firelight, the record of who we were. She had known. She had always known there was something in that box, and she had spent her whole life not asking because some part of her understood that the answer was not small. "What does it mean?" she said quietly. "For me." Now. Orion moved around the edge of the table until he was standing beside her, looking at the same parchment. The vile blood does not confer a title, he said. It is not a crown. He paused. What it confers is recognition. Every wolf in the kingdom, regardless of rank, regardless of clan, if they were close enough to you, if the scent reached them, they would know. Not what you are called, not what territory you stand in. Something older than that. He looked at her. It is why every alpha in the Vareth Hall registered you when you walked in. It is why Dorian Vareth's instinct was to court you, even if he did not understand why. A quieter pause. It is why I came looking. Clara held that for a moment. I am still a seamstress, she said. Yes. I still have a sister in a village who is wondering where I am. The messenger reached Ashen Ford yesterday morning, Orion said. Your sister knows you are safe. He paused. I also sent a separate letter, under my seal, informing her that her sister would be returning within the fortnight, with an escort. Clara looked at him. You were very certain I would stay. No, he said. I was certain that whether you stayed or not, she deserved to know you were not alone. The room was quiet around them. The candles on the table burned without flickering in the still, cold air. Clara looked at the manuscript, at her grandmother's name in old ink, at 11 generations of something that had waited, patient as stone, to be found by the right set of eyes. She thought about the great hall of Vareth Castle, and Dorian's hand over another woman's, and the long corridor, and the way this man had stood in the torchlight and looked at her as though she were worth looking at, and said that would be a considerable waste. She thought about 3 weeks of careful stitching, and a dress the color of wheat, and everything she had carried into that hall, and everything she had almost left it carrying. I want to be clear about something, she said. Then be clear. Whatever this blood means, whatever the Vial line means, it is mine. Not the kingdom's. Not the pack's. Not yours. She met his eyes. I will not be managed or positioned or used as a symbol for someone else's purpose. If I remain here, if I choose to understand what this is and what it means, that is my choice. Made by me. For my own reasons. Orion held her gaze. Yes, he said, simply and without reservation. That is the only way I would want it. She studied him for a moment, looking for the diplomatic performance, for the careful management she had seen from every lord and pack authority she had ever encountered. She did not find it. What she found instead was the same thing she had found in the corridor at Vareth Castle. A man who said what he meant without decoration, who had looked at her in a hallway when she was fleeing a humiliation and had seen something worth pursuing, and had pursued it not with flattery or pressure but with honesty and an open road. Then I will stay, she said. For now, until I understand what I'm working with. That is enough, he said. Dorian Vareth sent a letter to the Iron Keep 4 days later. It was addressed formally, requesting a meeting with the Omega woman, Clara of Ashen Ford, regarding a private matter. The letter was politely written and carefully worded, and arrived with a small wax seal that meant nothing to anyone in the Iron Keep. Orion read it, set it down on the table in his study, said nothing. Aldrich, who had been present, looked at him. Your response, he said. No response, Orion said. He had his evening. It is over. And that was the end of it. Clara stayed. The weeks that followed were not simple. Understanding the Vale record took time, and the lineage scholar Bren was meticulous and slow, and refused to speculate, which Clara respected. She wrote to Marta twice, and received 2 letters in return, the second of which contained the information that Marta had found the wooden box. It had been hidden behind a loose stone in the hearth wall, the folded parchment inside still intact. She sent back instructions to bring it. When it arrived, she and Orion opened it together at the stone table in the northern tower, in the company of candles and old ink, and the particular silence of a room where important things were kept. The parchment inside was a letter. written in her grandmother's hand. Addressed, with a certainty that should have been impossible and somehow was not, to the one who finds this when it is time. It said, among other things, that the blood would know its own, that it always had, that the right eyes would find it, in the right hour, and that when they did, she was to trust the recognition, not blindly, not without judgment, but with the knowledge that what the blood knew, it knew for good reason. Clara read it twice, folded it carefully, set it on the table. Orion watched her. "She wrote it for you," he said. "She wrote it for whoever came after her," Clara said. "She didn't know it would be me." "She knew it would be someone," he said. "And she trusted that person enough to leave them the truth instead of silence." Clara looked at the letter on the table, at her grandmother's careful, even hand, at a woman who had hidden something precious and trusted the future with it. She looked at Orion. "She had good instincts," Clara said quietly. "So do you," he said. And in the long, still room with the winter light coming pale through the narrow windows and the candles burning low on the table between them, Clara of Ashenford, last keeper of the Vale blood, granddaughter of Serath of the Western River clans, looked at the Lycan king who had come looking for her in the one room in the kingdom where she might be found, and she made her choice. Not because she was told to, not because the blood demanded it, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she wanted to, because some things, when found by the right eyes, do not need to be explained. They simply are. In the spring that followed, when the snow melted from the hills above the Iron Keep and the first messengers of the new season rode out across the kingdom, they carried news that traveled from pack to pack with the particular speed of things that matter. The Lycan king had taken a mate, not a noble's daughter, not an allied lord's heir. A woman from a village, a seamstress, a keeper of old blood that the world had thought lost. She had walked into a minor clan's banquet in a dress she had made herself, and she had walked out with something none of the wolves in that hall had seen coming. Not a title, not a rescue. A choice. Dorian Verath heard the news at his own table, over his morning meal, delivered by a merchant passing through on the way north. He set down his cup, said nothing for a long moment. Then he went back to his meal. There was nothing else to do. Marta came to the Iron Keep in the spring, riding in a cart with the wooden box on her lap, and a look on her face that Clara recognized immediately as the expression of someone trying very hard not to cry in public. Clara met her at the gate, and the two of them stood in the courtyard for a long moment, with their arms around each other, saying nothing, which was enough. Calder, watching from the battlements above with Aldrich, said something quiet that made the other man almost smile. Below, Orion stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched Clara with her sister, and the expression on his face was the one that Calder had described once, to Aldrich alone, late at night by a campfire, as the look he gets when something he has been waiting a long time for finally arrives. He had kept that promise. The silent one. The one he had made to himself in a dim corridor in Verith Castle, when a woman in a wheat-colored dress had turned to face him with reddened eyes and a straight spine, and had said I was leaving, and he had thought, with a certainty he had learned over many years to trust entirely, not yet. And he had been right.